In the liturgy of the Roman Rite of the Catholic Church, the altar is the table on which the sacrifice of the Mass is offered. Mass may sometimes be celebrated outside a sacred place, but traditionally never without an altar, or at least an altar stone until recent changes, a corporal now being sufficient. In the rites used in the Eastern Catholic Churches, altar can also refer to the whole space surrounding the table within the church building, with the table itself called the Holy Table. Precedent. In ecclesiastical history we find only two exceptions. St. Lucian is said to have celebrated Mass on his breast whilst in prison, and Theodore, Bishop of Tyre, on the hands of his deacons. According to Radulphus of Oxford, Pope Sixtus II was the first to prescribe that Mass should be celebrated on an altar, and the rubric of the Missal is merely a new promulgation of the law. It signifies, according to Amalarius, the table of the Lord, referring to the Last Supper, or the cross, or Christ. The last meaning explains the honor paid to it by incensing it, and the 5 crosses engraved on it signify his 5 wounds. Position. In the earliest church buildings, the altar was situated in a way that the priest faced east during the prayers of the Eucharistic liturgy, depending on the particulars of the specific church building in terms of space and orientation. This usually meant that the altar was placed at the east end, although there are also some notable exceptions, such as the Constantinian Street, Peter's Basilica, and the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, wherein the altar was at the western end. This meant that in order for the celebrant to face true east during the Eucharistic prayers, he needed to stand on the western side of the freestanding altar and face towards the doors of the church. These are not, however, examples of ancient churches in which the priest or bishop celebrated the Eucharist towards the people, as congregations in these churches would stand in the side aisles, facing the altar during the scripture readings and homily, but facing east along with the celebrant during the Eucharistic prayer. The basilicas of the Roman Empire were, as a rule, law courts or meeting places. They were generally spacious, and the interior area was separated by 2 or 4 rows of pillars, forming a central nave and side aisles. The end opposite the entrance had a semicircular shape, called the apse, and in this portion, which was raised above the level of the floor, sat the judge and his assessors, and before them stood an altar upon which sacrifices were made before any public business was to begin. When these public buildings were adapted for Christian assemblies, slight modifications were made. The apse was reserved for the bishop and his clergy. The faithful occupied the center and side aisles, while between the clergy and people stood the altar. Later on, the altar was placed in churches in the apse against, or at least near, the wall, so that the priest when celebrating faced the east, and behind him the people. In primitive times there was only one altar per church. Ignatius the Martyr, Cyprian, Irenaeus, and Jerome speak of only one altar. Some think that more than one altar existed in the Cathedral of Milan in the time of St. Ambrose, because he sometimes uses the word altaria, although others are of opinion that the word in this place means an altar. There is evidence of a plurality of altars towards the end of the 6th century. The Gregory the Great sent relics for 4 altars to Palladius, Bishop of Saints, France, who had placed in a church 13 altars, 4 of which remained unconsecrated for want of relics. Although there was only one altar in each church, minor altars were erected inside chapels, which were distinct buildings in which Mass was celebrated only once on the same day in each church. The fact that in the early ages of Christianity only the bishop celebrated Mass, assisted by his clergy, who received Holy Communion from the bishop's hands, is the reason that only one altar was erected in each church. But after the introduction of private masses, the necessity of several altars in each church arose. In ceremonials there is mention of the right and left side of the altar. Before 1488, the epistle side was called the right side of the altar, and the Gospel side the left. In that year, Augustin Patrici, Bishop of Pienza, published a ceremonial in which the epistle side is called the left of the altar, and the Gospel side the right, the denomination being taken from the facing of the crucifix, the principal ornament of the altar, not of the priest of the laity. This change of expression was accepted by Pope Pius V and introduced into the rubrics material of altars, although no documents are extant to indicate the material of which altars were made in the first centuries of Christianity. It is probable that they were made of wood, like that used by Christ at the Last Supper. At Rome such a wooden table is still preserved in the Lateran Basilica, and fragments of another such table are preserved in the church of Santa Pudenziana, on which St. Peter is said to have celebrated Mass. During the persecutions, when the Christians were forced to move from one place to another, and Mass was celebrated in crypts, private houses, the open air, and catacombs, except when the arcosolia were used, it is natural to suppose that they were made of wood, probably wooden chests carried about by the bishops, on the lid of which Mass was celebrated. Optatus of Milev reproved the Donatists for breaking up and using for firewood the altars of the Catholic churches, and Augustine of Hippo reports that Bishop Maximinus was beaten with the wood of the altar under which he had taken refuge. Gregory of Nyssa speaks of the consecration of an altar made of stone. Pulcheria, sister of Theodosius II, presented an altar of gold to the Basilica of Constantinople. Saint Helena gave golden altars ornamented with precious stones to the church which was erected on the site where the cross had been concealed for 300 years. The Pope Sixtus III and St. Hilary presented several altars of silver to the churches of Rome. Since wood is subject to decay, the baser metals to corrosion, and the more precious metals were too expensive, stone became in course of time the ordinary material for an altar. The Roman Breviary asserts that St. Sylvester was the first to issue a decree that the altar should be of stone, but of such a decree there is no documentary evidence, and no mention is made of it in canon law, in which so many other decrees of this pope are inserted. Moreover, it is certain that after that date altars of wood and of metal were erected. The earliest decree of a council which prescribed that an altar which is to be consecrated should be of stone is that of the Provincial Council of Beaune, France, in 517. The present discipline of the Church requires that for the consecration of an altar it must be of stone. The form of an altar. In primitive times there were two kinds of altars: the arcosolium and monumentum arcuatum, which was formed by cutting in the tufa wall of the wider spaces in the catacombs, an arch-like niche, over a grave or sarcophagus. The latter contained the remains of one or several martyrs, and rose about 3 feet above the floor. On it was placed horizontally a slab of marble, called the mensa, on which Mass was celebrated. The altar detached from the wall in the cubicular, or sepulchral chapels surrounded by loculi and arcosolia, used as places of worship in the catacombs or in the church as erected above ground after the time of Constantine. This second kind of altar consisted of a square or oblong slab of stone or marble which rested on columns 1 to 6 in number, or on a structure of masonry in which were enclosed the relics of martyrs. Sometimes 2 or 4 slabs of stone were placed vertically under the table, forming a stone chest. In private oratories the table was sometimes made of wood and rested on a wooden support. Within this support were placed the relics of martyrs, and in order to be able to expose them to view, folding doors were fixed on the front. The Liber Pontificalis states that Pope Felix I decreed that Mass should be celebrated on the tombs of martyrs. This no doubt brought about both a change of form, from that of a simple table to that of a chest or tomb, and the rule that every altar must contain the relics of martyrs. Usually the altar was raised on steps, from which the bishop sometimes preached. Originally it was made in the shape of an ordinary table, but gradually a step was introduced behind it and raised slightly above it. When the tabernacle was introduced, the number of these steps was increased. The altar is covered, at least in basilicas and also in large churches, by a canopy supported by columns, called the ciborium, upon which were placed, or from which were suspended, vases, crowns, baskets of silver, as decorations. For the middle of the ciborium, formerly a gold or silver dove was suspended to serve as a pyx in which the Blessed Sacrament was reserved. The veils or curtains were attached to the columns which supported the ciborium. The altar was often encircled by railings of wood or metal, called cancelli, or by low walls of marble slabs called traneni. According to the present discipline of the Church, there are two kinds of altars, the fixed and the portable. Both these denominations have a twofold meaning, i.e. an altar may be fixed or portable either in a wider sense or in the liturgical meaning. A fixed altar, in a wider sense, is one that is attached to a wall, a floor, or a column, whether it be consecrated or not. In the liturgical sense, it is a permanent structure of stone, consisting of a consecrated table and support, which must be built on a solid foundation. A portable altar in a wider sense is one that may be carried from one place to another. In the liturgical sense, it is a consecrated altar stone, sufficiently large to hold the sacred host and the greater part of the base of the chalice. It is inserted in the table of an altar which is not a consecrated fixed altar. The component parts of a fixed altar in the liturgical sense of the table, the support and the sepulchrum. The table must be a single slab of stone firmly joined by cement to the support, so that the table and support together make one piece. The surface of this table should be perfectly smooth and polished. 5 Greek crosses are engraved on its surface, one at each of the 4 corners, about 6 inches from both edges, but directly above the support, and one in the center. The support may be either a solid mass or it may consist of 4 or more columns. These must be of natural stone, firmly joined to the table. The substructure need not, however, consist of one piece, but should in every case be built on a solid foundation so as to make the structure permanent. The support may have any of the following forms: at each corner a column of natural stone, and the spaces between the columns may be filled with any kind of stone, brick, or cement. The space between the 2 columns in front may be left open, so as to place beneath the table a reliquary containing the body of a saint. Besides the 4 columns, one at each corner, a 5th column may be placed in the center at the front. In this case the back, and if desired the sides also, may be filled with stone, brick, or cement. If the table is small, 4 columns are placed under it, one at each corner, and, to make up the full length required, frames of stone or other material may be added to each side. These added portions are not consecrated, and hence may be constructed after the ceremony of consecration. If the table is deficient in width, 4 columns are placed under it, one at each corner, and a frame of stone or other material is added to the back. This addition is not consecrated, and may be constructed after the consecration of the altar. In the last 2 cases, the spaces between the columns may be filled with stone, brick, or cement, or they may be left open. In every case the substructure may be a solid mass, or the interior may remain hollow, but this hollow space is not to be used as a closet for storing articles of any kind, even such as belong to the altar. Neither the rubrics nor the sacred congregation of rites prescribe any dimensions for an altar. It ought, however, to be large enough to allow a priest conveniently to celebrate the holy sacrifice upon it in such a manner that all the ceremonies can be decorously observed. Hence altars at which solemn services are celebrated require to be of greater dimensions than other altars. For the words of the pontifical we infer that the high altar must stand free on all sides, but the back part of smaller altars may be built against the wall. Altar steps. In the beginning altars were not erected on steps. Those in the catacombs were constructed on the pavement, and in churches they were usually erected over the confession, or spot where the remains of martyrs were deposited. In the 4th century the altar was supported by one step above the floor of the sanctuary. At present the number of steps leading up to the high altar is for symbolical reasons odd, usually 3, 5, or 7, including the upper platform. These steps are to pass around the altar on 3 sides. They may be of wood, stone, or bricks, but St. Charles would have the 2 or 4 lower steps of stone or bricks, whilst he prescribes that the predella on which the celebrant stands should be made of wood. The steps should be about 1 foot in breadth. The predella should extend along the front of the altar with a breadth of about 3 feet 6 inches, and at the sides of the altar about 1 foot. The height of each step ought to be about 6 inches. Side altars must have at least 1 step. The sanctuary and altar steps of the high altar are ordinarily to be covered with carpets. If the sanctuary floor be marble, tile, or tessellated woodwork, at least a broad strip of carpet should be placed before the lowest step in plano. On solemn feasts particularly, rugs of fine quality are reserved for the predella and altar steps. If the whole sanctuary and altar steps cannot be covered, at least the predella of the high altar and of the other altars should have a rug. Exceptions to this rule: from the time of stripping the altars on Holy Thursday to Holy Saturday the carpets are removed. They are replaced on Holy Saturday before the Mass. During solemn requiem masses the floor of the sanctuary and the altar steps are to be bare, although a suitable rug may be placed on the predella and, when a bishop celebrates, in front of the forward stool. The same authority mentions that the carpet should be of green color, but any may be used. Care should be taken that crosses, images of the saints, emblems, e.g., chalice, lamb, etc., and monograms of the holy names, etc., be not woven into the carpets, for it is unbecoming and unseemly that the figures of sacred things be trodden upon. These remarks apply equally to marble, tile, mosaic, etc. Floors. Canopy. The Ceremonial Episcoporum, treating of the ornaments of the altar, says that a canopy should be suspended over the altar. It should be square in form, sufficiently large to cover the altar and the predella on which the celebrant stands, and, if it can easily be done, the color of the material, silk, velvet, or other cloth, with which it is covered, should vary with the color of the ornaments of the altar. It is either suspended from the ceiling by a movable chain, so that it may be lowered or raised when necessary, or it may be attached to the wall, or to the reredos at the back of the altar. It may also be a stationary structure, and this is usually the case in large churches, and then it is made of marble, stone, metal, or were beautifully carved and overlaid with gold or silver, in the form of a cupola erected on 4 pillars. In liturgy it is called the ciborium. The canopy ciborium is, according to the decision of the Rite, to be erected over the altar of the Blessed Sacrament, and over the other altars of the Church. But as contrary custom has so far prevailed that even in Rome it is usually erected only over the high altar, and the altar of the Blessed Sacrament. The purpose of this canopy is to protect the altar from dust or other matter falling upon it from the ceiling. A temporary canopy is sometimes placed over an altar in or outside the church. The framework on which such a canopy is erected is called the altarhouse. Formerly, between the columns of the ciborium ran metal rods, holding rings to which were fastened curtains which, according to the rubrics of the individual churches, were drawn around the altar at certain parts of Mass. These curtains were styled tetravella altaris. When the ciboria over the altar fell into disuse, a curtain was suspended at the back of the altar, called a dorsal, or dorsal, and two others, one at each side of it. They were hung to rods fastened in the wall reredos, or rested on 4 pillars erected at each end of the altar. The pillars were surmounted by angels holding candelabra, in which candles were burnt on solemn occasions. Originally the altar was made in the shape of an ordinary table, on which the crucifix and candlesticks were placed. By degrees behind the altar a step was introduced, raised slightly above it, for candlesticks, flowers, reliquaries, and other ornaments. This step was called the altar ledge. Later the tabernacle was added as a stationary appendage of the altar, and at its sides and behind it other steps were placed. They are sometimes called degrees or gradini. The front of these steps was sometimes painted and decorated. The gradini of Brunelleschi's Church of Santo Spirito, Florence, display groups of subjects from the Passion of Christ, coverings. From at least the 4th to the late Middle Ages the altar was covered from the view of the congregation at points during the Mass by altar curtains, hanging from rods supported by a ciborium, riddle posts, or some other arrangement. This practice declined as the introduction of other structures that screened the altar, such as the iconostasis in the east and rood screen and pulpitum in the west, meant that the congregation could barely see the altar anyway. The altar frontal is an appendage which covers the entire front of the altar, from the lower part of the table to the predella, and from the gospel corner to that of the epistle side. Its origin may probably be traced to the curtains of veils of silk, or of other precious material, which hung over the open space under the altar, to preserve the shrines of the saints usually deposited there. Later, these curtains were converted into one piece of drapery which covered the whole front of the altar and was suspended from the table of the altar. The use of a frontal which covers only a small portion of the front of the altar is forbidden. If the altar is so placed that its back can be seen by the people, that part should likewise be covered with an antepandium. Its material is not prescribed by the rubrics. It is sometimes made of precious metals, adorned with enamels and jewels, of wood, painted, gilt, embossed, and often set with crystals, or of cloth of gold, velvet, or silk embroidered and occasionally enriched with pearls, but it is usually of the same material as that of the sacred vestments. It is evidently intended as an ornament of the altar. Hence, if the altar is made of wood or marble, and its front is beautifully painted or decorated, or if the table is supported by columns, and a reliquary is placed under it, it may be considered sufficiently ornamented, and the antepandium would not be necessary. Nevertheless, even in such cases, on solemn occasions more precious and elaborate ones should be used. The antepandium may be ornamented with images, pictures of Christ, or pictures of the saint in whose honor the altar is dedicated to God, and emblems referring to such saint may be used. It is forbidden to ornament the black antepandium with skulls, crossbones, etc. Regularly, the color of the antepandium should correspond with the color of the feast or office of the day. The Missal says this should be the case, quod fieri potest, by which the Missal does not imply that one color may be used ad libitum for another, but that the more precious antepandia of gold, silver, embroidered silk, etc., in colors not strictly liturgical, may be used on solemn occasions, although they do not correspond in color with the feast or office of the day. The following are exceptions to the general rule. When the Blessed Sacrament is publicly exposed, the antepandium must be white, whatever the color of the vestments may be. If, however, the exposition takes place immediately after Mass, or Vespers, the antepandium of the color of the Mass, or Vespers, may be retained if the celebrant does not leave the sanctuary between the Mass, or Vespers, and the exposition, but if on these occasions cloth he vests for the exposition outside the sanctuary. The antepandium, if not white, must be exchanged for a white one. In solemn votive masses, the color of the antepandium must be that of the vestments. In private votive masses, its color corresponds to that of the office of the day. In private votive masses celebrated solemnly, i.e., with deacon and subdeacon, or in chant, it is proper that its color correspond with that of the vestments. The altar protector is a cover made of cloth, base of velvet, which is placed on the table of the altar during the time in which the sacred functions do not take place. Its purpose is to prevent the altar cloth from being stained with soil. It should be a little wider than the table and somewhat longer than the latter, so that it may hang down several inches on each side and in front. It may be of any color, and its front and side edges are usually scalloped, embroidered, or ornamented with fringes. During the divine services it is removed, except at Vespers, when, during the incensing of the altar at the Magnificat, only the front part of the table need be uncovered, and it is then simply turned back on the table of the altar. It is called the vesperal, the stragulum or altar cover. It need not be blessed. An altar stele was an ornament having the shape of the ends of a stele, which in the Middle Ages was attached to the front of the altar.